I would like to welcome our next speaker, Mr. Ziv Katzir, the head of the Israeli National Program for the AI Infrastructure at the Israeli Innovation Authority. In keeping with our previous discussion, he will lead a panel on the National Program for Artificial Intelligence Infrastructure. So, Mr. Ziv, the stage is for you.
Thank you very much, Jacob. So first of all, good morning and welcome to everybody. I'm Ziv. In the last 4 months or so, I've been leading the Israeli National Program for AI Infrastructure. The program is a jointly promoted effort, coordinated and collaborated effort for the Ministry of Technology, Science and Innovation, the Ministry of Finance, Israel's Innovation Authority, the Defense R&D Directorate, and the Higher Education Council. And our goal is to provide Israel the infrastructure, the tools it needs to remain in a leading position in the AI arena for years to come. We do that by promoting a few basic steps, basically. One is creating infrastructure. Infrastructure might be physical infrastructure, such as an HPC, or it might be the human capital infrastructure needed to allow us to continue and prosper. We do that by addressing the shortage in human capital, by promoting collaboration between all stakeholders in the public sector, the private sector, and the academia. We invest a lot of effort in promoting enabling regulation. That is, we want to make our regulation innovation supporting as opposed to inhibiting. And finally, we focus on implementing or adapting AI to the needs of the public sector. The first thing that we do is to promote an Israeli HPC, to close the technology gap existing today for natural language processing in Semitic languages. That is, I guess you all know that in Latin languages, we've seen a major leap forward, but for us, the people that speak less common languages, this advancement did not come yet. So this is something that we as a government do. And finally, as said, we invest in regulation and human capital. With me today are 4 extremely interesting people that I have the honor of hosting. First and foremost, retired Major General Professor Itzik Ben Israel, who is our host through those 3 days, the head of the Belbetnik ICRC, the former head of the Defense R&D Directorate, an interesting person altogether, I might say. Dear Dr. Orna, who today is Director of Technology in Google's Global Cloud Division, but formerly, and for many, many years, an entrepreneur, the Chief Scientist for the Government of Israel, and a true advocate for Israeli innovation. We also have Mr. Gal Shaul, CDO, a co-founder for Augury. Augury is a fascinating company, recently announced as an AI unicorn, and they're dealing with listening to machines in an attempt to prolong the life, reduce malfunctioning, and make them work better. And finally, Daniel Gabay, the CDO co-founder for Trigger Vision, a cutting-edge AI startup that embarked on a challenging task to compete with the heavyweight giants such as Amazon in creating true cashier-less shopping. So welcome to everybody. I would like to start with a question to Itzik and Orna. So the two of you are practically the godfathers of the Israeli program for AI infrastructure. And I would like to ask, how do you see our future? That is, if you look 5-10 years into the future, where do you see Israel, and what do you think we should do in order to get to this place?
So I just want to say one thing to Itzik. Actually, the first national program in artificial intelligence was initiated by Itzik. I was part of this committee looking at the infrastructure, which translates to HPC in our days, but also has quantum computing and has cloud computing. I will say a couple of things about where we are in 10 years, 5 years. I would like to see the public sector, the health, education, employment, using artificial intelligence in order to optimize their capabilities. And as you mentioned, Ziv, the gaps that are required require the adoption of a public cloud, including all the privacy, security, and everything that is in between that I think we know about, but giving the utilization for supporting the students, the teachers, the material, translation of excellent educational programs in education. And we have 25 years of data in health, and I expect us within the 5 and 10 years to be able to actually support decisions, medical decisions, to give a much greater support to patients in the health sector. And within when I mention employment, we want to be able to use the skill set and to move people ahead from areas that are losing ground to areas where employment is fully, which will utilize human resources in the center of Israel and in the periphery. So if you ask me in that regard, those are 3 areas that I see the natural language processing that you mentioned as well as something that is enabling the government of Israel to deploy artificial intelligence in the public sector. And I will stop here and will come back to any topic that people will be interested in order to allow Itzik to give his vision.
Thank you. One can understand your question in 2 different senses. How do you see Israel, you asked 5 years from now, from the point of view of infrastructure for AI, this is the national program that you lead, or from the point of view of AI generally, not only the infrastructure.
Where do you see it in general, and what should we do in order to do that?
Yeah, I have an opinion on both.
Of course.
I wish Israel 5 years from now, generally speaking now, not about infrastructure, will be one of the top 5 countries in the world leading in AI technology, that is including not only the technology by itself, but applications, commercial applications, money that comes to support it from abroad, etc., etc. The same thing that we did in the last 10 years for cyber security, or the same things that we are doing now for, I would say, 40 years or 30 years, generally in computer science and communication. This is what we call high-tech generally. And I had a long history together with Orna back to 30 years ago or more even, trying to make it as an essential, to make Israel as a kind of hub in those technologies generally. Now, all of this cannot be done, of course, with infrastructure. This is the meaning of the word infrastructure. And by infrastructures, we mean usually 2 things. One is, in our case, machines like computers, starting with what we used to call supercomputers, cloud, and ending with more exotic technologies like quantum computer. And the other one, which may be even more important than the first one, is talent. Okay, we need. We don't have anything else here in Israel in which we can base our very ambitious goal to be one of the top 5 countries in the world, but human resources. And so we have to spend a lot in talent, which is an essential part of the infrastructure. We have a plan how to do it. It depends on the government to support it. Certain parts of it can be done by different agencies without a need to hear something from the government. This is the whole nature of the so-called startup culture that we have here in Israel. But for certain things, we need some investment that only governments can do. If you ask me, is my vision will come true, let's say 5 years from now, it depends very much on the political institutes that will help us, or maybe not.
So maybe a follow-up question for the two of you. I'm obviously very pleased that we have a national program for AI infrastructure. I enjoy it personally, and I think it's crucially important, not to be cynical, but we've seen many national strategies coming from the US and the UK and the EU and many other smaller countries. And I must admit that when reading those programs, they all sound kind of similar, okay? Everybody wishes to be in the top 5 and lead the talent and lead the technology and lead the application and have a fully sustainable infrastructure and so on and so forth. And so I would like to ask the two of you, what should we do different? What Israel should do different? What are our strengths versus our weaker points when coming to create such a strategy?
I think I want to continue Itzik's line about the fact that in Israel, we don't have a national strategy. The fact that you are heading a national program, you're heading it and you're hearing different things from academia, different things from defense, different things from the Innovation Authority, and different wishes from the Ministry of Science and the Finance. On one hand, this looks terrible. On the other hand, everyone rushes to results on their own. And purposely, we look also at the public sector, because the public sector cannot utilize Gal's or Daniel's inventions unless there is Hebrew, because Hebrew is a very important component. On other things, we're always ahead of ourselves in terms of having the right infrastructure. So fortunately, another branch that we didn't even mention here, Digital Israel, have launched together with the Ministry of Finance a call for participation for a public cloud service, and they selected two public cloud providers. So we see everyone runs their way independently, not necessarily coordinating. Now, it can be awful, but it also can be utilized. And I think both Itzik and myself have been encouraging people to run the fastest, knowing that their efficiency will probably be cut by 6%, 10% relative to if they were where the market is, but the motivation and the empowerment of the know-how is very strong. So I say the weakest link in deployment of AI in Israel for primarily languages, but also because of the digital infrastructure, is the public sector. So most of AI that is civilly developed is for export. What Itzik and I think would like to see is also the embedding of AI within the state of Israel, because that by itself will create, much like what Itzik mentioned about cyber or about the high tech, will create by itself another motion of a different scale.
Okay, Orna already mentioned the issue of national strategy. You know that Israel was born in a war. Still, it's not yet over in a way, and we don't have a national strategy for defense. We did very well without a national strategy. This is part, I think, of a Jewish culture. It's not even Israeli. We live, we have the written Torah, the written Bible, and we still live by what we call Torah by heart, which is interpretation of what is written, what was is believed by many people what was dictated by God himself, okay? We live according to the interpretations of it. And this is something very unique to Jewish culture, and Israel used it. On one hand, it's more chaotic. The system is not so ordered as you can find it in the different countries. On the other hand, it makes us more agile in a way, and not so rigid in something that, walking by the book or something like this. I look at it in case of emerging technologies as an advantage, not as a disadvantage. And Orna already mentioned. There are other things. Israel, of course, is not as big as China or the US. And if you look on the numbers of graduates on AI graduates. In China, I wish we could have people as many as they have graduates in AI. We cannot compete this. Number was not, we never tried to compete on the numeric, on the quantitative field. This will not help us. On the other hand, we can choose wisely what to do, and the very, very fact that we are small enable us. We mentioned those teams that we led. Okay, it enables us to, in one day, to call everyone to sit in one room, speak with each other. The AI initiative that Professor Matania and me led, there were some 300 people working on it. All of them we know, from personal knowledge. We meet them. We met them in the military before. We meet them in industry, in the university. We live, and it's like a big city, one big city in China or the US, okay? And the people in the city, they know each other. It's a huge advantage. We talk, we create certain understanding, and then we can start acting. We as a general phenomenon, start acting without waiting to someone to tell us, go now to the right, go now to the left, and something like this. And it happens in many islands of the whole ecosystem. Also in AI, the plans that we submitted to the government was not yet approved by the government, but you can already see many activities done, and you have only to encourage it. I'm not against it, done by certain groups of communities, etc. And this is a huge advantage if you compare it to a different country. Small is not always a disadvantage, being small.
So you guys say agility and synchronization, basically, our ability to meet with one another. Good.
I wouldn't say even synchronization, say recognition of results and reuse of results. And I want to say, in addition to what Itzik has said, look, MAFAT, or the Office of the Chief Scientist, the Innovation Authority, depend a lot on the leadership. So in Israel, I say that the citizens are responsible for the government, not the government for the citizens. And as we agreed here, in a small country where we know each other, then we know the results and we can deploy the results. And when we have understanding that create a real gap, then we can define to the government that we need to close this gap. And it's also the government's responsibility, for example, in Hebrew or in computational infrastructure, because it's not in the interest of any private company or business, Israeli or global, to actually do that. And persistence works. It's not a matter of a logical decision because somebody is convinced that something is real. It's a persistence work, and in that regard, you have both Itzik and my complete backing to explain what people do not want to understand because it costs money. We have to do that because we have, we have to keep our defense up. We have to continue to support the economy. We want to distribute education across the country. We want to do many things that depend on technology. So all the supply chain of this startup called Israel is fundamental to us. And we both were educated on Zionism for the good of the people. So we do.
Thank you. Gal, I would like to ask you a question. You being a founding member of Gabay, and first, congratulations for being recognized as a unicorn. Not a simple thing. Can you share with us some of the journey that you've been through? And more specifically, where is it, or what should the nation itself do to allow other people walking your path, basically?
Yeah, so I would start by saying that the number one feature I think that can help Israeli culture is the mute button on Zoom. I would definitely not be able to have stayed quiet through all the smart conversation that happened earlier. So I appreciate the fact we're here. Yes, so hi everyone. At Augury, we've been at it for 10 years and we're building an AI solution for factories and for manufacturing. And what we help them do is understand and predict failures early on and before they become major or catastrophic, and reduce 75% of the unplanned downtime of plants. And we do that in manufacturing, and mostly in process manufacturing, which is what we know as manufacturing of diapers or toothpaste, food or beverage, or pharmaceuticals, and some wood products, right? So all of that are process manufacturing. We spent the first 3 years self-funded, and we were between getting a conversation that it's interesting in the US, meaning no one was interested, to, hey, did you really leave Intel for that job? I know a guy, they can take you in, right? So that was the more of the Israeli version of what we got the first few years. Digital transformation was not a big thing. AI was still from the 80s, kind of the earlier versions of that, or the sci-fi versions of that. And we went with kind of at a time where the entire country was obsessed with social and mobile and geolocation, or most startups were there. We were in enterprise industrial hardware plus cloud AI application. It felt very weird. As we moved along, it became a bit more transparent. We're a little over 300 people today. R&D and products and operations are in Israel, product and sales, marketing, and services are in the US. So that's been an interesting journey. We had only a recent round in Israel. All the other funding of the company came from the US. So the company is a bit split between that. I would say that what we were lacking in Israel and still are missing here, and would love to see more of that, is that AI, unlike a lot of the other software initiatives in Israel, and I would put cyber aside for a second, but AI requires adoption. It's an end user application. It's not infrastructure play. It's not building for someone else. It's building for the adoption of the current market. And Israel has been known, I think, where we've been most successful, what I've seen at least as our ability to be most successful, and as when we were the users, when we consumed the technology. So when Israel convinced itself or the world, or really had a need for defense, so we became amazing at defense technologies and later on cyber technologies. As a part of it, it wasn't about the technology itself. It was about, we were the early adopters. Eat your own dog food. There are millions of examples of that. But when you're the user and when you use that, you're able to create that. And I couldn't agree more with what was said earlier, that we don't need a lot of guidance. We have a strong culture with vision. And if we understand the combination between culture and vision, we would find a way. We actually, if the government would tell us what to do, we would already do something else, right? But we need a combination of vision and culture. And then we created a defense strategy of, we're not going to survive this, right? So it created those layers of, I need to survive personally, so I'll do whatever it takes. My company will do whatever it takes. The country will do whatever it takes, right? And those two things that led us up to here are not necessarily, at least in my opinion with AI, is not what's going to take us forward. Because that created the culture of the, I don't know, the means or the cause justifies the end, the cause that we have justifies the means, and it's not necessarily the case going forward. When I look into the future, when I look at what was blocking us, it was adoption in Israel. We went to the US for early adopters. Our first pilot wasn't here. We were laughed at factories. We were laughed at the industry, kind of Israel industry, right? So we went abroad. We're coming back to Israeli factories from the global corporates. Now it's mandated by Nestle. Now it's mandated by Procter & Gamble. And this is where we won't be able to move forward. If adoption won't exist, I have my personal opinions on adoption, and it requires a level of equality and education for sectors that we didn't necessarily believe in. So equality and education would be first, and then marking the enemy, right? Because we're always looking for one, marking the enemy as climate change and not kind of everything defense. If we won't be able to unite around climate change and equality, it would block our adoption in almost all AI applications that I know of. And maybe I'm a dreamer, but I believe that we can do that, and we should be able to do that. If that would exist, Hebrew would already exist. The people that would build that infrastructure could be private or public. If we would understand that that's where we're going, and we need to lead the world, not in showing how it's done, but actually getting to zero emissions 20 years before the target of the world. 30 years before the targets of the world. We're so small. Everything that was said here about the tech industry, about the high-tech industry, is also true for the country as a whole. If we would decide as a vision, not as a strategy even, that we're going to get there in half the time, we would make it at half the time. And then all the technologies would make it there. Everything there is an engine to drive there. So I may be a bit optimistic, but I really believe that if we'll be able to create that demand and generate some more education to areas that we don't look at today, people in factories, operators of buildings, right? People at schools will be able to create that entire adoption and make it a reality instead of other industries that may need some less attention from us going forward.
Thank you very much. That was truly enlightening. Daniel, I would like to approach you with kind of a similar question, but then again, from your point of view, being a smaller company with huge ambitions.
Yeah, thanks. So maybe I'll say a word about Trigo. So what we developed in Trigo is a technology for a seamless shopping experience. So customer go into a store, take whatever they want, and simply go out without waiting in line. So from the beginning of history, people went to some stores or the market and waited to pay for something, and now it's not necessarily anymore. And currently we have already open stores for the public in Central European capitals. I think when we're talking about AI and challenges, and especially in Israel, so AI in general, there are many challenges about explainability, knowing when it will work and how well the neural network works. And there is a lot of issues about the data you generate for the AI, and about privacy and regulations. And if I think about Israel in a nutshell, there are a few things that makes it sometimes much more challenging for a smaller startup to start actually working in Israel, and there is huge advantages. So maybe I'll start with the huge advantages. There is a great talent density in Israel. I think the number one thing, there are great universities, so many people, very smart people joining together and are making the startup nation and high-tech boom all over the country. If there is one thing I will emphasize, as there will be more and more people and the academia will increase, more people will finish a master's degree in the universities and a PhD and so on, I think the entire ecosystem will benefit. One main challenge in Israel is about regulations. Israel, it's much more difficult to open an autonomous store in Israel than to open it abroad. So we have autonomous stores abroad. There is a regulation about how to sell fruits and vegetables in Israel. There is a regulations about placing pricing per item and so on, but you not necessarily see it in other places worldwide, making it sometimes harder to cross the final line to open something to the public, and make it more challenging in those regards, especially in Israel.
Thank you. So I want to address a question to all of you, and probably this is going to be the last one before we head up for questions from the audience, specifically focusing on regulation, as Daniel mentioned. There are voices that claim that we as a small country should simply wait and adopt the regulation that's being developed today, say the EU AI Act, and probably we're going to see some corresponding efforts in the US and other parts of the world. So should we be the leads on this one, or where should we be the leads, and which part should we simply adopt?
I may volunteer to answer. It depends, of course, on your global vision. It's not only the vision in this area or that area. Look at Israel. I mean, of course, we can wait. We have good talent, good infrastructure, relatively good infrastructure. And there is no doubt that AI will be part of anything we will do here, because this is the future of technology in the next 10 years or so, okay? The question is, what do you want? I mean, what type of life you want to live? What type of economy you want to build? We could do everything. We heard here about climate changing. I mean, should we make Israel as a kind of a hub, global hub for improving the climate problem? Should we put our resources in pharma and solve the problem of not of serious diseases like cancer or heart diseases, things like this? We are a small country. We have not so many people. We have to, and this should be done by the government, not by the entrepreneurs that come from, entrepreneurs is always something coming from bottom up. We have to choose those areas which fit our constraints, not having too many people, not having too much money to invest in heavy infrastructure, etc., and then let the natural talents that we have here to work, and we will find ourselves in a good position. I'm very skeptical about the areas that I mentioned. We succeeded very much in selecting the previous topics. The last one was cyber. Okay? It fits our constraints. You don't need too many people, 2, 3 people, young people with a good idea can do a lot. You don't need to invest millions, sometimes billions of dollars before you prove the idea, etc. The government has to choose the right direction. The rest should be done, of course, from bottom up by the people. We do this right, we will succeed, and we have a proof of concept. I mean, cyber is already something like this. Something like more than 40% of the global investment in cybersecurity by business sector finds its place in Israel, in Israeli companies. This is something that proves, I mean, and we are competing China and the US and all those countries that were mentioned.
So if I'm taking your words and taking it to regulation, you say, take the large-scale regulation from abroad, and then for those domains that are picked, set the supporting regulatory environment. Right?
First of all, yes. Secondly, I just want to mention, in addition to cyber, we have another program that is on the run in quantum science and technology. When the program started, there were 3 companies in Israel, or 3 or 4, I don't remember. By now there are 30. The number of scientists, including scientists who moved from different disciplines in physics into quantum science, has gone up by 25%. It's not a very large community, but it's significant in 2 years. So what Itzik is saying, I fully agree with it. But I'm saying it depends again on leadership or in areas. And you need to be a real leader to go through the hassles of an antagonistic environment and to make sure that you have a proof point and you build them one by one. Sometimes you need to go abroad and come back. in order to do things with other countries and then to come back and do it in Israel. Sometimes you know that eventually the market will consume you. Daniel is competing with Amazon Go. Potentially somebody else will come and eventually will acquire him, and there will be another R&D center for a large corporation. Maybe it will be successful as other companies like Checkpoint have go up and made it. So the key issue is keep the momentum up and identify what are the areas that are fundamentally important. Now, the way you do that, you list what you have and you want to empower, and you list what gaps you have and you need to close them. And we mentioned a few gaps. We mentioned the public cloud, we mentioned the high performance computing, we mentioned natural language processing in Hebrew. Those are critical gaps. You have very good machine vision in Israel. You have Mobileye, you have Trigo, but the issue is that scale it, because if Mobileye now is going independent from Intel into the market, they need to scale up, and where will they find the people that they need to scale up with if we don't educate the people? Much as Gal said. So you have here 4 people. Each one of them is doing things their way. And if you at your position stand for a minute, you look at what you can pick from each one in order to go forward. That's the way. It's everybody in Israel wants the state to be successful, to be secure, to be prosperous, to augment the economical infrastructure, and to pay taxes in order to, means not to pay taxes as a goal, but to pay taxes in order to improve the public sector. Just look at everything you have, and each one will be willing to come forward to assist in order to make things happen in the country. So I'm saying, look at all the pillars that build our life. Look at all the strengths we have and keep accelerating them, and look at the gaps we have and fill them. That will be the strategy that it doesn't require from you to have one top person that was elected and will be listened to. Nobody is listening to anybody. They're not listening to Itzik and they're not listening to me. But at the end of the day, we get our way because we're persistent. That's it.
Thank you. So I'll move to questions that we got from the audience. And maybe Gal and Daniel, the first question will be to you guys. Someone on the audience is asking, what's your opinion about solving our human capital problems by, let's say, hiring international talent? So what do you think about international talent as a solution to the gap we have here?
I think it's already happening, right? I almost don't know of Israeli companies that don't have that, and kind of an innovator's dilemma, that becomes the main challenge that we will have. We'll start outsourcing, right? Kind of initially smaller, simpler tasks that no one here wants to do. And over time, there will be created other areas of innovation. We would be an expert in something and then you're being thrown out. I think that over time, Israel would need to understand where we want to invest the talent pool and try to increase it from within. I know there are a few programs on that with Palestinian and Arab population, with other sectors that are not as much involved in that, and some religious areas and some geographical areas of Israel, but that still would be limited. I think the need to invest in those is critical, and we would need to be more focused on where we want our talent and how to utilize it best, right? The amount of talent in Israel that is utilized or people choose to work in things that are related to gambling or porn or even some parts of defense are not things that I'm proud that we're building, right? So AI for porn is very important. I'm not sure that this is where we want to be invested in over the next 20 years. And I think if we'll be able to help people make different choices, we might see other things growing here. And we would need to select what not to do. That would be the main part of it. Yes, there'll always be some outsourcing or some talent coming from abroad, either to work in Israel or work remotely in the current environment that we have. Even this event is happening remotely. It might stay like this for a while. But the decision of where are we developing an ability to adopt technologies and to create net new technologies is critical, and being very deliberate and explicit about that is very critical.
Thank you.
I'll just say that I fully agree with Gal that you need to outsource some, because sometimes, and as every company that grows, there is a limited talent pool here in Israel, and when you go global, you go global. But there is a very big advantage sometimes in the Israeli culture of making things, and why there's a lot of innovations here. And so our core IP stays here in Israel, and what we are looking for is a way to increase that. And so as we outsource and we try to grow, the main pillars, but what makes us unique, stay internal. And for that, we need more talent density, also in Israel, and some ways that the government will increase this pool.
Thank you very much. A second question, we've got only 3 minutes, so guys, please be brief. There was a question about grand challenges. So grand challenges presented by the government as a means for advancing innovation and technology. What do you feel about that?
Okay, I'll take it, but the grand challenges are infrastructure and language. We cannot assimilate artificial intelligence in the public sector and be users such that we train many people who are not the inventors because of the language, and we have only about 10 million people who speak Hebrew. By the way, commercially, Hebrew and Arabic are very close, and we can do both at once. And that is something that the government needs to put in. And you cannot do machine learning without infrastructure. You need to compute. It's not something you need to store, to compute, to network. It's not something that you can do up in the air. And consequently—
But how would you feel about grand challenges published, say, in education, in transportation, in agriculture? So what if the government comes and presents a challenge and then asks the private sector people come and solve it? What do you think about that?
So micromanagement in Israel doesn't really work. And also there is a pipeline that starts with education, be it school, academic, at all levels, building the future with certain people who will conduct research, because we are shrinking relative to the world. And then in addition to that, also training people, as both Gal and Daniel described, you could do a lot of insourcing in Israel. So we mentioned all of those issues. We mentioned the education at all levels. We mentioned the needed infrastructure that no commercial or civilian body will provide you. Several things like that we need to do as a country. And if we need the hammer to go and punch, we'll do that.
If I may, the grand challenges in AI, speaking about AI, is not really technology. It's more human nature. I mean, you can do wonders by correlating one data set with another data set, let's say for health, okay? The problem is trying to convince those who own the data sets to share it with others, okay? This is human nature. It's not technological at all. Trust, things like this. If you ask me, these are the grand challenges of AI, and not the technology. Technology, we will be better than most of the other countries in the world. Overcoming those human nature is one of the forces of nature. We have to remember it. This is the problem.
Well, thank you very much. With this, I would like to first thank you for joining. I can say that I've enjoyed this session very much and I hope that you have enjoyed it as well.
Thank you, Ziv.
Thank you.